Honorable Prime Minister of India and the President of the European Commission and the European Council. And under this partnership, we are working together with India in the area of energy efficiency, renewable energy, smart grids, power market design, sustainable financing, cold chain, energy efficiency in buildings, and also climate action, adaptation and mitigation, and also climate proofing. Actually, tomorrow we will have another event, EU, not in the context of the expo, but that event will focus on power market and electricity markets, regulation. So you're also very much invited to attend that meeting. And actually, information on what we are doing as EU, you can find on our Twitter account and our website. Today we will discuss offshore wind, which is a very important source of renewable energy in Europe, and it's getting more and more important also in our planning towards climate neutrality in 2050. And in 2050. So offshore wind is a very important energy source, and because of that, we have actually done two very big studies together with India, together with the Ministry of New and Renewable Energy, and also with our very important partner, NIWE, in Chennai. We have done one study called FORWIND, facilitating offshore wind in India, which focused on assessing the potential for offshore wind in India and doing the basic studies. After that, we did another big project called FOPI, the first offshore wind project in India, in which we tried to do all the necessary studies for realizing an offshore wind project, and we were focusing on the state of Gujarat. After that, we organized a study tour in November 2019 for Indian officials to the Netherlands and Denmark to visit ports and other infrastructure to make offshore wind viable. And during that study tour, several times also the issue of skills required for offshore wind was discussed, which made us decide, and we discussed this with the Ministry of New and Renewable Energy, which made us decide to do a study on what skills are required and what skills are already there in India for other sectors like the offshore oil and gas sector. And also we had a look at what trainings are there to meet these skills, what trainings do we have in Europe, what certification is needed. So under our project we did a study. That study will be presented today, and we have, as you have seen, an excellent panel that will both react on the study and also react on the broader where we are with this very exciting renewable energy sector. So thank you very much. This was my introduction. Once again, I wish you a very fruitful session with hopefully very concrete measures that we will then also be able to still incorporate in the thank you very much, and back over to you.
Thank you so much, Edwin. Ladies and gentlemen, may I please call upon Mr. Neil for a report on gap assessment of training and skill building in offshore wind energy sector in India. Neil, please.
Thank you. I'm sitting here with my colleague Søren, who has been the main producer of the report we're going to talk about. I'll just share a presentation. Which you're hopefully seeing now. So we have prepared this report on skills, training skills for offshore wind. I've promised to be very brief, so I'll skip on immediately. Just to supplement what Edmund said about the background, the reason for one justification for this is the fact that India has a long-term target of 30 gigawatts of offshore wind power. And that is actually, I think, a little bit more or just about what is in the entire North Sea or in the Northern European space, so it's quite ambitious. We can say that to develop this from nothing, or rather from two components. One is lots of onshore wind and the other is experience with offshore oil and gas. There's a lot of requirements for local training and skill. So that's why we've taken stock of the situation and made some recommendations. So the objectives of the report, which is regrettably not available yet, but will be very, very soon, is to assess key institutes and training programs already existing in India, identify gaps, map technical expertise in the EU, and produce some recommendations for the offshore, to develop the offshore wind sector skill base in India. The main findings are that there is a good demand for or reason to develop capacity building, of course, some qualification packs. The figure to the right is sort of an indication of the areas we've looked at. There's also a suggestion to have a common knowledge portal, a common place where all this information meets and the people need it, and to develop the frameworks as such for offshore wind, that be it both legal, economic, and regulatory, including safety and health and so forth. There are lots of collaboration opportunities, mainly within standard certification, R&D, and training. And of course, basic skills. All of this will require conducive policy environments so that these things can live on when they're no longer, say, funded projects from outside. The figure here is just sort of an overview of the issues. I won't go into detail there because the main findings are here. We have identified some key Indian and EU institutes for which collaboration could be facilitated. On the Indian side, and I'm happy to see that some of these institutes are represented today also on the panel. Of course, there's NIVE. There's a Skills Council for Green Jobs, Indian National Center for Ocean Information Services, the National Institute of Oceanography, and the Institute of Technology in Chennai. So these are what we have identified as the key Indian players. Of course, there are many more. And looking on the EU side, on the institutional side, that's universities and institutes, we have listed here a number. I won't even read them for you. I will just use this to say that there are lots of cooperation opportunities in the EU. Here are basically institutions and universities from Brussels, or sorry, from Belgium, from the Netherlands, from Germany, and from Denmark, and also from Ireland and Sweden. And those are the main countries. You can look further in the EU. We've sort of focused on those who are actually active specifically in offshore wind. Similarly, on training, there are training providers for offshore activities in India, Elite, Maersk, Sagar. And we see in that field, which is health, safety, and so forth, we see lots of synergies with the oil and gas sector in their offshore activities. On the EU side, there's a whole community of trainers and also a certification system, the Global Wind Offshore certifications. So we have Maersk, which was also in India. We have BFW. We have a Global Wind Academy, Danish Wind Power Academy. We have Lucas Nülle. In Germany, we have Monson. We have Vulcan Training. So lots of training providers who could either cooperate with or extend their activities to India based on this expected growth to 30 megawatts or gigawatts within a limited number of years. Some of the qualifications that are needed in the development phase of a offshore wind power project are listed here. We've sort of distinguished between development phase, construction phase, and operation phase. And after that, there's a decommissioning. We've not looked very much into that. It's way out in the future. But the first phase, of course, is development. And there we have identified needs for qualifications in site selection and project development. And that's basically economic and technological skills. There's a very big activity, also depending on the regulatory environment, with environmental impact assessment and wildlife surveys. Marine wildlife of any kind, birds and so forth, in order to ensure that a offshore wind power project does not do unnecessary harm and can maybe even be located where it does the least harm. Of course, there are the technical, conceptual and feasibility studies, the layouts, the naval architecture and so forth. Also the high voltage connections, the transformers, whatever goes on offshore and brings the power to shore. Of course, there's financial feasibility, not so much different from other feasibilities for offshore, but of course with the specific elements of offshore. Then there's already in the development stage, the logistics, the port studies, where can this be based and shipped from and so forth. Also oceanography and hydrography skills, geophysics and so forth. Of course, the preliminary engineering, which is physical, mathematics, electrical, mechanical, and then already in the development phase leading on is the tender support, how to tender such projects, including the harbors. It's not only the offshore installations, just as important are the logistics onshore. Going on to the construction phase, we have looked in depth into, employment related directly to the one-off activities for each project, and looked at the tower manufacturing and supply, foundation manufacturing, foundation installation, turbine installation, array cable installation, and general installation support and logistics. We have estimated a relevant direct employment of 80 to 825 person years per gigawatts in a given project scale of gigawatts. But we've also noted that if you take the entire value chain related to such a project, it's probably 20 times as much, something like 15,000 persons years per gigawatt. So the potential for employment is significant in the planned deployment of offshore wind. And that's really one of the key messages here. When we look at the operation phase, we also have commercial operation management, of course, monitoring and marine coordinators, technical specialists, data analysts, administrative people, health, safety, and environment. Here we have estimated a direct employment of 90 person years per year for 1 gigawatt. But again, looking backwards in the whole value chain, also in the operation phase, we see something like 2,200 person years per gigawatt. Again, more or less a factor 20 to the direct employment. This is based on aligning, bottom-up specific estimations with literature and other surveys. So this is a potential evaluation. Some of the key improvements needed in the skills sector in India is comprehensiveness in existing training courses. There are some courses, some activities. They should be seen in a general context and be comprehensive and complete. There needs a system for benchmarking and mapping and benchmarking of skills in order to ensure that the resource base will be there. There's a need for collaboration among the industries relevant for offshore wind, and that includes the offshore oil gas and the onshore wind. And then there's a need for training institutes and certified courses. Some of the hard activities in offshore then need certificates. People that are certificate or holders of certificates, it's not enough to say we've done a course. You need to also have passed the test, so to say. That leads to a need for qualified trainers in order to conduct this training, and that's obviously a place for cooperation between the EU and India, train the trainers and so forth, and of course develop curriculums and graduate courses and so forth. So the key actions to develop offshore skill framework moving forward in India is development of qualification packs. This is a bit of a repetition, creation of a knowledge portal, creation of tools and frameworks also for financial institutions in order to get adequate financing, institutional capacity building of the institutions we mentioned before and others, develop offshore wind standards relevant for India, that is, look at the international ones, modify, adopt, and so forth, but ensure that they are the right ones. Use collaboration opportunities for certification. For sure, certification is a global industry, but India can play a significant part there. Use the collaboration opportunities for research and development. There are already collaborations, we know, for example, between the Danish DTU and Nive, but that can be expanded much more. Make as much or to have as much benefit as possible from the offshore oil and gas sector. Share experiences in this development phase. It helps everybody. There's enough work for everybody, I think. So peer training and so forth to quickly expand the resource base is very relevant. And of course, all this has or requires a conducive policy environment, which is also part of the development of offshore wind, is the whole institutional regulatory side. This was very quick, but that was the idea. So I thank you for your attention and pass the word back to the chairman, Amar, I guess. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Neil, for sharing the report. Now, may I please welcome Mr. Amit Kumar, team leader and the leader Energy PwC India, who's also moderating the session to the dais, please. And he's joining us physically. May I also join Mr. Vijay Murthy Tanikala, advisor, Van Oord Offshore Wind, BVN director, Van Oord India Private Limited, who's joining us physically. We have our guests who are joining us virtually, which are Mr. Dr. K. Balaraman, Director General, National Institute of Wind Energy, Dr. Jochen Dirksmeyer, Head Development, WPD Offshore Solutions, GmbH, Mr. Amar Variva, Director, Vestas, Mr. Gunnar Herzig, Managing Director, World Forum Offshore Wind, Mr. Marcus Koistus, Head Business Development, RWE Renewables, Mr. Carl Heiermans, Senior Business Development Manager, Offshore Department. Thank you so much. And Amit, the floor is all yours.
Thank you. So, first of all, I would like to welcome everyone to this hall, and I can see that this is almost full, and it's heartening to see, particularly in the environment like this. We, on behalf of PwC, European Union, and also from the organizers and former markets, welcome you all to this session. Quite an important one from the off-wind. Now, we all know that the government has set a target and the stakeholders are working towards it. 175, which we know that next year by December now, and 450 by 2030. Now, to achieve these kind of targets, a complete ecosystem is required, where it's not only the solar, which is going to take a lion's share, but the other technologies also, who will play an important role. In this connection, wind had been the leader, and we all know till now the wind had the maximum capacity on the ground, and followed by solar, and now solar has taken off. So within wind also, to achieve this ambitious target, we have to look at offshore wind. Now, this is something which is happening on the ground, particularly in European countries, in developed countries. They have improved upon the technology, they have worked on the business models, and with certain policy initiatives and the action points which the governments of the day are taking, it is becoming viable. Now, the same thing from our perspective for a country like India, which has good wind, offshore wind potential, we also have to take this. Now, I will not take much time because the panel we have today is a very high profile one. Those who have done it on the ground, those who have, put together the ecosystem, those who are working with the government, are in the government, or are project developers, globally. So, as the organizer introduced, we have 7 experts, 4 from European countries, and welcome all 4 of them, Dr. Jochen, Mr. Gunnar, Mr. Marcus, and Mr. Carl. And from India side, we have the fortune of having Dr. Balraman, Mr. Vijayamurthy, and I'm especially thankful Mr. Vijayamurthy because he's here physically present on the dais. So 2 of us have the company at least on the dais, and 5 others from virtually, and Mr. Amar Variava. So these 7 experts, and I have some to moderate it because we have the hybrid event, so to say. So what I have decided is that maybe from the relevance of what Neil presented earlier, that means the capacity building, skill development, which is the topic for the session, required for offshore wind, as to what needs to be done given their experience. And I will also request the panelists if they can comment on the report which was presented, the brief of the report which was presented to them, the relevance of it, and because we will take a cue from your comments, from your suggestions and your experiences to further work on the report which will be presented to all the stakeholders, including the government of the day. So with this, I will first invite Dr. Jochen Duxmeyer, who is the Head Development WPD Offshore Solutions GmbH from Germany. Dr. Jochen, in your opinion, what are the key technological and institutional tie-ups which India must look at, and basically to ensure right skill sets are in place for this offshore wind sector? Dr. Jochen. If you can unmute yourself, Dr. Jochen, yeah.
Sure, sorry for that.
Thank you.
So first of all, thank you very much for you inviting us to this session. We are basically following the developments on the offshore wind sector in India since quite a while. Back 3 years ago, 2018, when the first initiative from the government came up, well, we got to know that, and basically since then we are very closely following up what is going on in India, and we feel that there is quite some movement, quite some momentum within the industry within the last couple of months. So this basically fits perfectly also to the development of offshore in Europe, but also in all over the world, particularly in the Eastern Asian markets, where also the focus on offshore becomes stronger and stronger from year to year. And well, this also reflects in India. This also made us that we established our own footprint with our own company in India, basically just this summer. Yeah. I could say that we, as probably several other companies as well, are quite excited, basically, by the announcement of the government of India with such a target, 330 gigawatt until end of the decade. This is really a lot. You said that already earlier, that this is almost what we are looking at in the German, not the German, but the European North Sea. Well, but India is such a large country, rather a subcontinent, so it is worth it. So coming back to your question, what do we basically expect from, or what is the takeaways from Europe, and what can we copy to India maybe? This is definitely that in all the countries from the very beginning we have seen strong commitments from the government towards this industry. This is first very important that a target is explained. The target is there in India. This is very strong. This is very good. But also it has to be supported by a further story, a roadmap. So really each single individual year, which capacity has to be or shall be added, and also by which means. So is it some kind of independent development? Is it an auction system? Well, in India, we would expect that it will be an auction system because you have made such good experience with that in onshore and in solar sector. What I think the industry needs is really a clear policy with detailed a roadmap showing how much capacity per year really to be added on, and also supplemented by, well, the relevant support mechanisms which usually are in place at least to get things started. But well, it is not only regarding roadmap and targets. I think it's also, and this is probably most relevant for a country like India, where well, costs are very, and price for energy is very sensitive. Well, basically in every country, cost is very sensitive, but we see other countries that come with quite high tariffs or start the industry with quite high tariffs. To get it started, obviously this is not the intention of India, fine, but then still what we need is at least supporting framework requirements, for example, like grid connection, that at least this is really reflected within the national grid planning, that that capacity, 30 gigawatt, which is really a lot, is also shown that the transmission system can work with it, so that really all the power can be transmitted all over India to the consumers. I think there is still something to do, at least in those two, or in particular in those two states of Tamil Nadu and Gujarat, where we're talking about. Well, then also, most of the countries in Europe, the TSO, transmission system operator, is responsible for the grid connection. That might also be a mechanism worthwhile to think about for India, because it would take a bit responsibilities, but also scope from the project and bring it basically to the natural player there. The grid operator basically has to operate the grid, not only on land, but also on in the sea when we come there. Maybe one last point, and then I give it back to you. Also, infrastructure-wise, the ports, they are also very important. This is also what we have seen in the European countries, that the government took responsibility to develop the ports in regards to the requirements of offshore wind. This is really different requirements than usual containers and bulk and so on. There are also significant investments have to be done, and probably it is not the best way to put that responsibility on individual projects because they cannot pay for that, but that be offered by the government, and then that each project can use it well and pay some rent for the time while it uses it. This is maybe some first points for the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jochen. And important ones, two takeaways, as you rightly mentioned: the roadmap, year-wise capacity, infrastructure, which is the responsibility of the government, and then the private can obviously pay for the infrastructure which is to be created by the government. At this point of time, I would like to invite Dr. Balraman, who is the Director General of NIWE, National Institute of Wind Energy, because they have been instrumental in creating this culture of offshore wind, acceptance of it, and then providing the data, information, and also encouraging different stakeholders in coming into the sector. Dr. Balraman, if you can delve upon how the offshore sector and in India, including its potential assessment, designing, grid integration, policy advocacy, what are your views on this? And given the thrust around offshore wind nowadays, as we are discussing also, what are the developmental plans of NIWE around it? And later on, if you can also touch upon, because this is quite an important from Indian perspective, the skilling aspect, the capacity building and training which is required to really execute it on the ground. Over to you, Dr. Balraman.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, organizers, for inviting me for this distinguished panel. And my apologies for not being physically present there. And because of this present world, we have a hybrid mechanism, and we are fortunate to have to interact with you beyond the remote corners. So just to make a small briefing on what has been happening today, as you're aware, we already started working on the 1 gigawatt the offshore wind measurements, and also all the oceanography studies have been done for Gujarat, and for which some of the data is made available for all the public consultations and the people to download and do the analysis. And we have also carried out the geophysical, geotechnical studies and the rapid EA studies for this 1 gigawatt. So for this 1 gigawatt, for most of the de-risking mechanism, what is required for the project is already done for Gujarat, and that is it ready. And we have been shared whatever data to be shared properly that we are sharing. Some of the data we are waiting for a permission to share the data. So this 1 gigawatt is already on the pipeline to move forward. And moving forward, we are also trying to have the resource assessment and other oceanography studies to be carried out in Tamil Nadu coast, where the wind speed is going to be more promising compared to Gujarat part of it. So we are trying to see the zone C, zone A, and zone B, and zone E. These are the blocks roughly is going to cater to a need of almost like 10 to 15 gigawatts. We are trying to analyze those markets. So this is going to give more impetus in making the information available and how we are going to move forward for research measurements part of it and make all the stakeholders to be ready for the investment part of it. Now coming back to the challenges, what we are trying to talk about is, of course, the main challenge is going to be how we are going to bring down the LCOE. That's going to be very, very critical because the LCOE is going to be the key denominator when you are talking about the kickstarting part of it. So of course, our ministry is working on various aspects of this particular aspect of it. But the critical one, what I am trying to talk about the aspect is to how can we learn from the onshore journey to the offshore. If you see the onshore journey, we are seeing very clearly the last 5 to 6 years we invented the India-specific wind turbine. More than 30 to 35 models are coming to the Indian-specific part of it, where the same location, what used to be having around 30 to 35% CEF, we are getting around 38 to 40% CEF. That means now we have the turbine which is having low specific power, and this turbine is going to give the right on the lower LCOE. The same kind of a thing need to be taken care of in the offshore segment also. And today, if we try to talk about the same turbine, what we are going to have in European waters, if you are bringing the same turbine, the LCOE could be costlier. So we are trying to see very clearly how best we can have the India specific, or rather I talk about the medium and the low wind specific turbines, so that which is going to cater the needs of the not only Indian context but also on the Asia Pacific region, where we have predominantly medium and low wind region compared to European waters where we have a high wind region. So this is one area where definitely we need to start working on technical part of it, so that the OEMs will be having a very clear demarcation how best they have to invest on this particular turbine, so that they have the market ready for them to implement it. Now coming back to your the question on skill development, yes, skilling and reskilling is an important aspect of it. As you're aware, the Skill India Council and the Green Jobs, we are already working on the various courses, and of course we are looking for this report to come out so that we can take additional qualification packs so that this can be made available for the people to be trained. And parallelly, we are also trying to have what is called a Vayu Mitra, where we are trying to talk about making the skilling and reskilling of the people, because as you're aware, India is one of the largest technical manpower producing countries. So we have a large pool of manpower, and these manpower need to be skilled and reskilled to suit the needs. And this is going to be a good employment opportunity. Not only the employment, we're talking about skilled manpower opportunity is going to be made available. So we are working on that particular aspect of it, and as we move forward, we'll try to take the help. Presently, DTU is working with us, and we're also trying to take from the help from other universities so that we can move forward on this particular aspect of it. Thank you. I'll stop at this stage. I'll take the questions at the later time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Balraman, and we'll be happy to share with you the report so that you can also make it a part of your ecosystem. At the same time, your comments and suggestions would also be welcome from our side to work on upon further. Now, I have the pleasure of inviting Mr. Gunnar, who is the Managing Director, World Forum Offshore Wind. And, it's the only organization which is 100% focused on promoting offshore wind on a global scale. Now, Mr. Gunnar, given your worldwide experience and not only in Europe, but globally you are promoting this and working with different stakeholders. What areas in capacity building and training programs India particularly must look at to expand the offshore wind energy? I mean, you can also dwell upon the evolution of it in different markets, but particularly on this aspect, how, because this is the beginning, so to say, in India. So how we should take it up from the beginning itself. Over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Mr. Kumar, and thank you very much for inviting us. Great pleasure to be part of this exciting discussion, and really excellent to see so much interest in offshore wind in India, because it's really one of the most fascinating offshore wind markets coming up. And to answer your question, I think what has worked well in most countries who have developed a successful offshore wind industry is really to get some key parameters right in the beginning, and then you can build on that. And maybe let me just summarize those key parameters very quickly. And they are always linked to skills which go with those parameters. So I think it fits nicely to the great report that has just been done and presented. So first of all, of course, you need a clear regulatory framework that needs to be stable and made for a long term. And once you have that in place, everybody knows what we're talking about. And you can have different systems in place, doesn't matter which one really, as long as it's clear and designed for the long term. And then, of course, you need people who can work with this regulatory framework, understand it, and can really liaise with all the relevant government authorities to make sure you work within those frameworks. Then the second aspect is a coherent maritime spatial planning. So it's really clear who can build what and where in the sea, and zones are designated for certain activities. And it's really clear that you don't have any stakeholder conflicts which can hold up projects, but you really have this kind of spatial planning in place. And again, on the skills side, people who know about this, who can really execute this spatial planning into action and make sure projects are developed adequately and in line with this spatial planning. Then, of course, we have the permitting process, where it needs to be clear who issues which permit. Is it one central stop-shop authority, or is it various local authorities? Ideally, maybe one-stop shop has always worked well, so it's very clear for developers that's the authority that issues the permit, and no one else can overrule that. And then again, on the skills side, of course, you need people who can work with those permits, make sure everything is done towards achieving those permits, so that the projects progress according to specific milestones. We then, of course, have a suitable harbor infrastructure that needs to be in place. And for offshore wind, we're always talking about extremely heavy components and a lot of space that's required, since we're talking about gigantic foundations and turbines, and to store those components on the quay side, that really takes up a lot of space. So you need to have that space in place, and a sufficiently strong harbor to really carry all the weights. So once that's in place, you're good to go. And of course, again, you need people who can operate those harbors and have the installation capabilities in place, and all the personnel who can really make sure components are being loaded onto installation vessels and then shipped off to the site where you want to build the offshore wind farm. And lastly, the fifth point really is the entire topic of grid infrastructure. And here we're talking about the offshore grid infrastructure, and then the question always is, who builds that? Is it the developer or the grid operator? Can be either one, as long as that's clear. And then, of course, you need the onshore grid capacity to really export all the electricity and really make sure those grid connections are in place. Because what you don't want, what happened in Germany in the early days of the offshore wind industry, that you have your entire offshore wind farm ready to go, but then no grid connection, so you're not able to export all the electricity. You want to avoid that, so therefore that's really the last key parameter that needs to be in place. And that's just a quick summary from our side with regards to the main parameters that need to be in place, and the skills and the corresponding skills that you need to have to build a flourishing offshore wind industry. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Absolutely clear in terms of the three parameters, skills and this infrastructure and the grid connectivity issues which you highlighted. And we also noted the skill aspect which you mentioned. At this point of time, let me bring on board, invite Dr. Amar, Mr. Amar Variava from Vestas. because Vestas has been one of the developer and the key supplier of wind turbines across the world. So Amar, what initiatives does India need to take in terms of skilling of the workforce, especially in the manufacturing sector? Because you have been involved in that kind of aspect. So from the manufacturing side, if you can dwell upon as to what is that it takes to from the skilling perspective, and given that India is expected to be the key market going forward in the offshore wind, so how do you plan for it? Over to you, Mr. Amar.
Sure. I think this is a very relevant question. But before I jump to the skilling aspect, first of all, we need to understand from the OEM standpoint that why would even OEM think about, expanding their capacity in India for offshore wind. Especially when we are heavily right now working in onshore wind, and we have almost everybody has expanded their manufacturing capacity in the country. But when it comes to the offshore wind, we just need to understand one principle, that offshore wind is not equal to onshore wind. It's a different kind of a ball game altogether. So we cannot extrapolate the learning of onshore wind to offshore wind. We need to treat offshore wind very separately, and that goes very true with the skilling aspect also. Also, I would like to put forward some more points here before as I said, before I come to the skilling point. If OEM wants to come here and put up a facility, capacity expansion or a skilling, they would like to understand three aspects. Number one is that we would be very keen to see the long-term, sustainable and predictable policy regime, because that is one aspect which will decide everything. And here, when I talk about this aspect, it actually talks about if we are going to be going for a local content here, definitely the tariff structure will not be supportive if we import the turbine and then assemble here. It won't be a good economic scenario. And if you want to develop the local content here, definitely it will require a local jobs and it will require a local skilling. Now these turbines are not a small turbine. Even the minimum length I've seen that for the turbine blade is around 75 meter. It is not 75 feet, it's 75 meter. And this requires a lot of precision kind of manufacturing and the setup. Also, when you actually are making this kind of blades in your factories, handling of the blade, handling of the mold required special kind of skilling. Then the second point would be that around the infrastructure aspect, skilling is also required at the port, because these kind of a long blades will be you will be transporting from your facility to the port. I've seen in Denmark that they have developed a port called SPI, where they have given a pre-assembly area where you can keep your finished goods like the section of the tower or blades. We need to think about similar kind of setup in India when it comes to infrastructure, and that too very close to the wind farm, offshore wind farm. Then of course the logistic strategy. We need we need to see how many vessel can port can handle, and apart from that the heavy vehicle which will be going and moving away from the port. So that is very important aspect. Grid already was mentioned by some of my fellow colleagues. And last but not least is the effective financial model that we need to think about. So all these three parameters, if they fall in place, definitely OEM will think about investment in the country. Now come to the skilling part. See, we have been very instrumental in the onshore wind skill development activity, and that was our commitment to Honorable Prime Minister way back in 2015. We have in fact developed around 8 to 10 qualification packs and the national occupation standards for onshore wind, and that includes working at height, then working in the manufacturing floor, how to deal with the blade manufacturing process, how to deal with the nacelle and hub manufacturing process. So those kind of parameters we have adopted from a global wind organization and try to develop the very customized qualification packs for Indian situation, Indian condition. And once these particular, so we need to probably think about similar kind of packs and QPs development for the offshore wind. Once those are developed, then we need to also see which are the organizations or the academia which will teach these kind of courses. Of course, the OEMs can also provide the help and support in terms of training these the people. And once the program comes under the Green Council, Green Job for Skills Council and the National Skill Development, the program, then it has to be certified kind of a, the arrangement. That means the people will go for a program, they will go through the training program, and finally they will become certified. Once this kind of certification comes, then they will be actually qualified to work under the offshore kind of regime. One good thing here is that there's a lot of opportunity because offshore wind is only going to grow from this point onward. Another good point is that we are in the beginning of the decade. We are in 2021 and we have another 9 years in our hand to plan and to execute the different kind of activities related to offshore wind. Skilling is definitely going to play a very, very significant role. As I said, onshore wind and offshore wind are very different. Here, even my operator or O&M person has to go and attend the turbine in helicopter or in the boat. This requires another kind of complexity altogether. Sometimes now the new kind of vessel have come into the market where you can also stay there. It's like a small hotel room and your work area. So a lot of new things are popping up now, and we need to adopt to those kind of changes and the new requirement. And of course, skilling will definitely play a very, very significant role in that. That's all.
Thanks, Amar. And I think your suggestion of involving academia, educational institutions, NSDC in India, in Indian context, National Skill Development Corporation, and utilizing this whole ecosystem for skilling, capacity building, so that we can execute the plans is really, really good. And that's what in our report also we have mentioned. In fact, we have mentioned about the tie-ups between Indian and European institutions to that extent, so that we can take benefit of the worldwide kind of skills and the capacities we have. So at this point of time now, I'll like to invite Mr. Marcus from RWE for their experience, because they have quite a huge experience, 2.4 gigawatt of offshore wind already installed and more than 10 gigawatt which is in the plans, right? So what is your experience, Marcus, on this? And again, because the topic of the day is the skilling, the capacity building training, and because, we also want to involve, as I said earlier, from the beginning itself, right? So if you can touch upon that aspect as well, so that, we can gain a benefit out of your experience on this. Over to you, Marcus.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kumar. First of all, RWE Renewables is very pleased to see that the Indian offshore market is now really gaining momentum. We have also expressed our interest in the offshore wind sector in India in 2018 when there were first discussions on creating the industry, and have since very closely followed the market. We believe that India has now the advantage not to just repeat the lessons that the European offshore wind market has done over the past 20 years when RWE installed their first offshore wind turbine, but really leapfrog those learnings and not start from scratch again. And when we talk about what was really important for us as an industry, it was to drive down the LCOE over time with economies of scales and really thereby creating public acceptance. So for example, last week, RWE was awarded 2 offshore projects in Germany that were based on 0 subsidy bids, which is illustrating how low the costs have now become in those days. And what were the factors that could be applied to India and are essential for the Indian offshore wind market to go down a similar path? It's really, as some of the other speakers have already said, it's the roadmap that lies ahead of us. The 2030 targets of 30 gigawatts is a great starting point, but we need to understand how this is broken down when our friends from Vestas need to invest in nacelle and blade manufacturing capacity in India. They need to have very firm commitments on those gigawatt targets per year, basically. And they need to see that there are steps undertaken, such as approval of the viability gap funding and other things that are demonstrating the commitment of the government and the industry to India to really drive this process forward. Also, what we need to develop and see there is the permitting, the regulatory regime that we have seen in many markets tends to be very scattered in the beginning. But for example, RWE is a strong proponent of allocating the technical permitting to institutes such as NIVE, basically, to bundle them into a one-stop shop and really thereby create a one-stop shop for stage 1 and stage 2 clearances. We discussed the importance of infrastructure hubs, and let me expand maybe a little bit on that. When we talk about infrastructure hubs, it's not just the ports. Obviously, there are construction ports and operations ports that need to be fit, but it's the connection points for the grids that need to be cleared, that need to be reinforced to really host those 30 gigawatts. The industry, once it's known where the hubs are and the qualified ports are, can then allocate the capacities in those areas, build knowledge, skill up people in those regions, and really create jobs in the regions that form clusters from which further developments can be done. We also believe it's important to have a supply chain approach that is market driven. So rather than imposing very strict local content requirements from the start, the Indian offshore wind market can be helped by, for example, relaxing import duties on the first components that might still need to be imported from abroad, whilst then building a domestic supply chain that can scale up over time to really deliver those 30 gigawatts. When it comes to skilling, as said, we should really leapfrog the learnings from Europe here, and that's where companies like RWE can support with our expertise. We have hundreds of people working in offshore wind that are keen also to transfer those learnings to India. We're, for example, working together with universities in South Korea and Japan to create coursework there, but we are also inviting technicians and engineers from those markets over to see on study tours and to our offshore wind farms that are already constructed here in Europe to see how operations and maintenance is done, how construction is done, and that's what we would also transport to the Indian offshore wind market, where this experience from developers and operators such as ourselves is really then transported to India. Maybe a final point there is in the setup of the auctions, how can we ensure that that knowledge is really transferred, is when we design the auctions to really make experience in operations and maintenance and experience in construction and eligibility criteria for these auctions. We have seen that was very successful in countries like Japan, for example, and that can really help the industry to also have winners in these auctions that are credible in ultimately delivering those.
Thank you so much, Marcus, for these comments. In fact, how we wish that, without any subsidy or viability gap funding, the offshore wind becomes viable and, this is acceptable by the distribution companies and the consumer. I'm sure that day is not far off, but still, we are looking for the VGF and the subsidy at this point of time. Your other comments with working with universities and those skilled persons being made available to work in India and other places are really welcome, and we look forward to work on that. Now, from somebody who has been working not in the industry but in the related services, I would like to invite Mr. Carl, and he's from Zandonal, and they have extensive experience in dredging services. So, dredging services, there are similarities because, those skill sets, those experiences are quite useful, particularly in the offshore wind sector. And that's why, we have invited Carl. Thank you so much for joining this call. Carl, from your experience, how this can be utilized for more efficient operation, installation, infrastructure, etc. in case of offshore wind. Over to you, Carl.
Well, thank you for inviting us also on this interesting event. Maybe to start with, Jan de Nul, you know it obviously from a world player in dredging activities, and we have been doing several jobs, dredging works already in India. I personally have been active quite some while ago already in Gujarat for a dredging project for the oil and gas sector. But Jan de Nul has evolved also in today is also a main player in the construction of wind farms. So we have invested in special equipment, new vessels to install the cables, to install the foundations, and to install the turbines. So as we're speaking, we're even building a couple of very new vessels that will be ready from next year to install the next generation of turbines. Now we're talking about turbines going to 20 megawatts and beyond even. So we are already quite active into this field, obviously not in India yet. Now to explain the difference between dredging and offshore wind, maybe, well, if I go from a very basic dredging project, if we would be doing the maintenance dredging of the channels of Mumbai, and compare that with building an offshore wind farm, well, I internally explained to us, our people, that the biggest difference is in dredging, we are maybe studying it 1 month and then we can dredge 12 months. And in offshore wind, we have to do the studying, so that's a very detailed engineering before we can go and then work 1 month. So we need a lot of resources to do this engineering part. And it's not only the engineering of the cable and of the foundation, but it's really the engineering on how we install, so the methodology, all the details that are involved into this new market. So there's a lot more engineering involved. And that's a big challenge. And especially then, for instance, when we're looking at going to new countries. So Jan de Nul has been the first to install wind farms in Finland, in Sweden. Last year we did also something, a very small project in the US, as one of the first players over there. But those were still very much support from the European experience and the supply chain and the ports and so on. So you could say it's still easy. Now,
Yeah, we can hear you. Please carry on.
Okay. I have a sound. But if you look, for instance, a couple of years ago, we started with the first wind farms in Taiwan, and that's maybe a very good example to compare a little bit with India. India has the advantage over Taiwan that they have an oil and gas experience, and you also have some very large industrial players, groups, with capabilities of building a big project. So these are the advantages. Nevertheless, when we started up offshore wind in Taiwan, we had to bring over between 100 and 150 engineers to prepare the projects over there. And it's only over a time of 1, 2, 3 years that we now have been able to train people who were generally trained as engineers or in other industry fields, to get them prepared to work in the offshore wind industry. So it takes time. Even if you would prepare people locally, it's not that easy. Once you go into the real construction, you need, in the first projects, you will need to import a lot of knowledge, a lot of equipment also. Don't underestimate the special vessels that are used for the construction. I would not be surprised that these are coming from abroad because you only need them for a short time. On the other hand, once you go into the operation and maintenance, we believe that this is markets that should be filled up immediately with local content, with local players, because they have to be there for the long term. So yes, it is possible, and I know I'm not going to repeat all the challenges about the ports, the grids, and so on. It's obviously there, and it will have to be done. We see this in every country that's starting with offshore wind, but we are also a believer in the Indian 30 megawatt, maybe not by 2030, but we have to start and really set up a target per year, and that's the way forward, I believe.
Thank you so much. In fact, quite useful because, from your vast experience in different sectors, including dredging, oil and gas and others, I think we need to learn a lot from there as well. Last but not the least, I would like to now invite Mr. Vijay Murthy, Advisor One Wood, Offshore Wind. Uh, One Wood, your company has quite a good experience in the EPC and delivering turnkey projects. So, your initial thoughts on what are the expectations from the key stakeholders, particularly keeping in mind the offshore wind? And then again, on the skilling aspect, because you have been present here, you have been working elsewhere as well, as to what we need to do from the skilling perspective, taking on a cue from what others have already said. Over to you.
Good afternoon to everybody. Thank you for giving this opportunity to discuss on the subject offshore wind energy. As everybody said, offshore wind energy is gaining importance in the renewable energy in the recent past very much. And where in the Europe and the East Asia, a lot of projects already started. India is yet to commence their first project. Last couple of years we were discussing about starting a project, but so far nothing has happened. But when you talk about the experience of us as a Vanwood, the cost reduction which you talk about in the project's implementation is largely depends upon the generators, and where we talk about in the Germany we started with a 4 megawatt WGs, and when in Bosley it came to 9.5 things. So with that, the cost of productions has come down very largely. For instance, in 2016, when cost of kilowatt was coming to 1.7 euros, in the Bosley in 2020, it became to 0.70. And to achieve this, the supply chain is also very key important. And because in Europe, the government support is large, so the supply chain also progressively improved to handle the various projects in the world. But when in India, that had to still to start. Some studies have been done, and once a project starts from initially, then it can generate more supply chain and it can help for the forthcoming projects. And similarly here in the installation part, which is very cost-effective measurements, if are adopted, then it helps the project. For instance, a lot of studies, geotechnical studies that we handled, but to design the required monopolies and installation and for cabling and also. Those things also still to be done in a large scale, and we have a lot of experience in the West. So with that, we can do definitely a better job here also. When it comes to the Indian requirement, any delays in the installation activities can increase the cost. So for that, there should be proper schedule of a project, and the supply chain management is also had to be improved largely. And we don't have a proper port facilities yet. Though the Gujarat, we have a couple of ports, they are meant for the different kind of target cargo. They are never meant for these kind of offshore projects. We need large storage capacity, and we need to have closest to the site whichever is going to be implemented, and all these things have to be addressed well in advance. That is one of the things. And as far as Vanwood is concerned, so far we built around 14.5 gigawatts, and that such experience largely is helping us to address the other areas also. When it come into India, there are so many things have to be done, and especially what we need is an attractive support mechanism with long-term policy. Then the viability gap funding is also important here, because when you talk about the presently renewable energy with very low cost, but when the initial project of an offshore industry project is going to be very expensive. So to match this, there should be viability gap funding. Once that is in place, in future things could be improved. Similarly, see, for award of the project, it is very expensive proposition to tendering and all that. So there should be a definite support from the government about their what are the plans for the offshore energy in India, and what are the gigawatt they are going to produce, and year-wise expectation that will help. And this is also similar to the offshore oil and gas industry. So some of the tax benefits which are given in the oil and gas industry should be extended to this also, like a 10% 44 BB also is there. Similarly, for the GST and the excise duty remittance also to be given, so that it helps the project implementation and for a beneficial thing. Then there should be a commitment. There should be a commitment to discover the competitive pricing also, so that the whatever the price is accepted should be viable for the coming projects for next 2-3 years. Then there should be a period of 5 years at least for commissioning, and the long-term success depends upon the government support and optimizing supply chain and crucial of cost reduction for the Indian projects. This is also reasonably developed in Europe over a period with the government policies and the market demand. So various Indian ministries and departments have to give grant clearances for offshore wind projects. This could result in delays and cost overruns. To avoid such delays, the MNRE and NIVI may obtain certain clearances basing on the project even before tendering. Certain clearance which requires by the developers in detail can be obtained by the concerned contractors subsequently by giving their personal details. Present post capacity is inadequate for storage and handling of offshore wind equipment. These posts are essential for installation on and during O&M of the turbines, as well as the dismantling of the project. Identified posts near the selected posts should be encouraged to develop the required handling capacity and port facilities. So the early announcement of award of a project will definitely help to hasten the offshore wind industry in India. The skilling is concerned, there's a lot of opportunities for the local people to get in and engaged in this offshore industry. For instance, a fisherman also can be trained, and they also can be utilized for the installation of various equipment, etc. And during operation also and maintenance also, their services can be utilized. So there's a lot of opportunities for the employment generation, and it's going to be a sea change once this project starts, because each project is life cycle is around 30 years. But all the 30 years, a lot of employment generation also can happen. So this most government should announce first project as soon as possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Vijayamurthy, for these comments and the suggestions, and in fact covering the entire industry, the need of the industry as such. I know we have already crossed the time. As a quick summary of what we have discussed today, I wish we could have more time, but a roadmap, a clear-cut roadmap till 2030, 30 gigawatt is what is required. Just as in other sectors also of renewables and some other infrastructure related, a clarity on sustained long-term policy, VGF or subsidy, whether it will be available and how much will be available, till how long will be available. That kind of a clarity will be useful for all the project developers, and that will also help the manufacturers in planning their, going forward. There is a talk in the town about RPO, a renewable purchase obligation, dedicatedly for offshore wind, and hopefully that will come in one of our earlier interaction with the government. They mentioned that they are thinking about it. If that comes up, definitely that will be a leg up, because then we know that this much capacity will become viable, or is mandatory for the players to have on the ground. On the skill side of it, large-scale global companies, they were there in the panel, they shared their experience. Some of them is a learning for us as well as to how they brought about this change and what they did to achieve the desired objective. We will take that as an input to our report, which NIRAS and PwC under the EU project, CECP project we are taking up. And we will also get in touch. Hopefully you will not mind in case we share with you the report and for your observations as such. And tie-ups tie-ups between industry and academia, academia and academia between Europe and India will also be a useful element going forward. That's what one of the things. I'm sure this will help giving a leg up to the entire offshore wind sector and achieving the objective of 30 gigawatt in 2030. And thank you so much for participating in this. I'm not able to take the questions from the floor, but pardon me, but maybe we'll collect it and then pass it on later on for your responses. Over to you, Info Market. Thank you so much, all the panelists.
Thank you,
you very
Amit, for
much.
summing up the session so well. May I now please invite Mr. Edwin, Councillor Energy and Climate Action EU Delegation, for his closing remarks and vote of thanks, please.
Okay, thank you very much. I think this was a very interesting and information-rich session. Thank you very much to Mr. Kumar for moderating it so excellently, and also many thanks to the presenters of the report. Many of the people in the panel I've met before, and it's always a pleasure to listen to you and to hear your opinion. It's actually the same messages always coming back, but what we today added is that for all these different steps, we need people that actually do the work and that have the knowledge, and all these steps are extremely important for making offshore wind a success in India. So for setting the target, for defining the roadmap, for assessing how to plan your supply chain. And there we learned that probably in the beginning you will need engineers from abroad for certain parts of the process, and you will need to train your local engineers. You will need certain vessels from abroad, and you will have, for the operation and maintenance, your own vessels. We also learned that avoiding delay is extremely important in the whole process. The costs are the key factor. You want to reduce the cost, and that means avoiding delay. Also in the regulatory framework, you need the right expertise. In the permitting process, where several of you referred to the one-stop shop, you need the right expertise. In the spatial planning, in ensuring that you deal with who does what, where, and at sea, you need the right expertise. In the area of port development, grid connection, you need the right expertise. And later in the process also for the decommissioning. As one of the speakers said, there is indeed the opportunity to learn from the lessons that we have from the experiences that we have made in Europe, and to also learn from mistakes and learn from the solutions. And actually it is possible for India to leapfrog. One of the speakers also said that the offshore wind sector is one of the most fascinating markets coming up, that there is momentum in the region, that it will be required for meeting the 450 gigawatt target in 2030. We as EU are very keen on continuing our cooperation with India in this important sector. We are very keen on working together with Dr. Balaraman, and I'm really happy that he was here today. We are keen on working together with him on doing research and studies, but also in the area of skilling. And I'm quite convinced that the study that has been presented and that will be updated on the basis of today's meeting will be very instrumental. And we're also very keen on working together with the Ministry of New and Renewable Energy, so we're also in discussion with them. And we will organize additional events. We are thinking about study tours to make sure that at some point this fascinating sector, as it was called, becomes reality in India. So thank you very much. Thank you to all the panelists, to the moderator, to the organization, and also very importantly to the audience in Greater Noida, and also the audience that has attended this webinar virtually. Thank you very much. A very nice afternoon to all of you.
Thank you
Back
so
over
much.
to you. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Edwin. And with this, we come to the close of day 2.